Phantoms appear in many shapes and forms, there one moment and gone the next. But where have they come from, and where do they go? Well, some say we catch glimpses of other beings as they move between their realm and ours, restless, troubled, or vengeful souls stuck in a space between life and death, perhaps inexplicably tied to a piece of land they just can't or won't leave. And the thing with phantoms, they can appear in the strangest places. The wild, remote moorlands near Quilicot in southwest Scotland are exactly the sort of place you'd expect to stumble into a ghost or a wild beast, but no one could have imagined this dark encounter. A drover was heading north on foot, crossing the bleak moor of Quilicot to reach a farmhouse and secure some work. He began his journey in the afternoon, but by the time he had reached the path over Quilicot Hill, it had already become dark, and flashes of lightning alerted him to an oncoming storm. Loud peals of thunder and flashes of lightning were followed by a quick downpour of rain. Then the storm broke in earnest, and the drover desperately looked for shelter. The only protection at hand were mounds of hedges growing beside the road, so the drover and his dog carefully crept under them to wait out the storm. He waited there a good hour and noticed the sky was growing darker and darker. At last the storm subsided, but the sky now was so dark he could barely see a few feet in front of him. Still, this was no place to see out the night, and the drover and his dog set out again for the farmhouse. With visibility poor, their pace was slow, and it must have been near midnight by the time they reached the most desolate part of the moor. Still they pushed on in the dark and silence. The drover's dog, a faithful collie, walked several steps ahead of the man as though to guide him through the darkness. The rain was persistent, but this did nothing to discourage the Scottish native, and he was hopeful of reaching the farmhouse and its warm welcome and hearth soon. The collie slowed its pace, then stopped, giving a low whine, not a growl, mind, but a whine, and crept close to stand hunched at the drover's heels. The drover took the opposite stance and stood as straight as he could, eyes searching the distance in every direction to see what the dog had seen or had smelled on the air. He saw nothing, but he heard what seemed to be the unmistakable sound of bagpipes. "Surely not," he said to none but the dog. "All the way out here, and at this time?" The sound was coming from down in the glen between the hills, and as he stood listening, he heard the skirl of bagpipes carrying towards him on the wind. The piping became wilder, louder, closer, a shrill, piercing, feverish wailing. The drover shook in terror. Whatever it was close and coming upon him. The behaviour of his dog did little to assure him of their safety. It whined in fear, creeping and huddled behind his feet and scratching at his legs in desperation. The drover made the decision to stand his ground. He knew he had nowhere else to go, but he decided he would meet whatever was coming toward him upright, not running or cowering before it. Then he saw it. A blaze of blue light flashed only yards in front of him, and in its centre appeared the figure of a piper, his bagpipes standing straight up, backlit by the bright blue light. The figure moved erratically, backwards and forwards, playing wildly with no discernible tune, but edging ever closer. Fleeing the scene was no longer an option, so the drover stood, wet and trembling, frozen to the ground. Fear shuddered through him as he saw that the piper was headless, and more that the silhouette of his body was so thin and the blue light so bright that he could see the distant moor and surrounding hills right through his headless body. His horror was broken by a sudden blinding flash of light, followed by a piercing shrill, and that was the last thing he could remember. The drover woke on the wet ground, sprawled among the heather, his dog laying by his side. The blue light, the bagpipes and their headless piper were gone. He wasted no time in continuing his journey to the farmhouse and arrived there well before dawn. His surprised but hospitable hosts gave him dry clothing and bid him to calm and sleep. When he woke, he shared his experience with the family, but his story was met with stunned silence until the aged father of the farmer nodded his head and said, Aye, lad, ye have seen the ghost of the piper. He was brutally murdered on the Corsic moor on his way to Paddisthorn long ago, and there he dwells. I know this to be true, for I have seen him my own self. Most who visit the moorlands and highlands of Scotland will tell you they are home to more than meets the eye. Countless are the anecdotal and recorded accounts of apparitions and creatures encountered in this ancient land. If you enjoy true tales of strange encounters, please consider becoming a member of my YouTube channel. Just click on the join button below for more info on how to join and the exclusive treats I have for members. Now, I have something special for you. This could well be the most bizarre phantom encounter you've ever heard. In the years 1926 and 1927, Dr. R. Clay managed the site of Bronze Age excavations at Folkestone on the Dorset coast. Every day he drove the same route from his home to the excavation site and back again without incident. One day he was driving home in the late afternoon, as he had done dozens of times before. He took a straight road which cuts through Cranbourne and Sixpenny Handley and noticed, in the corner of his eye, a horseman riding parallel to his car and going in the same direction. This struck Clay as curious, but nothing more. Then, as his car reached the spot between a small clump of beech trees on his right and pinewood on his left, just where the road dips a little, he could see, through the clearing, the rider violently turning the horse's head and galloping hard. He appeared to be racing toward the crossroads, and it occurred to Clay that the rider was trying to reach the approaching crossroads before the car. Perhaps he means to reach it first and force me to stop the car, he thought. Well, archaeologists are known for their curiosity, it must be said, and Clay welcomed the encounter. He lowered gear to slow the car, just enough to match the pace of the rider and ensure they reached the crossroads together. As they drew level, Clay noticed the rider turn his horse's head again and urging it into a strenuous gallop. They were exactly parallel with the car at a distance of around 50 yards. It was only then Clay could see this was no ordinary horseman. In a series of glances, Clay observed the rider's legs were bare. His only clothing appeared to be a long, loose sort of cloak which billowed behind him. As for the horse, it had a long mane and tail, as was expected, but it wore no bridle or stirrup. Clay caught glimpses of the man's face, but could make out no features. He quickly assumed his motive was less than friendly, though, as he continually raised one arm into the air threateningly, waving some kind of implement or weapon above his head. Far from frightening Clay, this only encouraged his interest. He slowed and guided the car carefully to allow him a better view of the horseman. The story his eyes told him seemed inconceivable. The features of the rider were undeniably familiar, although he had never seen them before. He was looking at a prehistoric man. After travelling parallel with the rider for about 100 yards, an astonished Clay watched as both rider and horse disappeared before his eyes. Clay stopped the car and examined the exact area the horseman disappeared. He found there traces of a low, round, prehistoric barrow or grave mound that he had never noticed before. He marked the spot and made a point of passing the place every day of the week at all times of the day, looking for the angry phantom horseman. He never saw him again. So, an educated, highly respected man, firm in his conviction of what he saw that day, and more than happy to put his name and reputation against a published account of his strange encounter. Food for thought. Well, if you like this video, check out the video on the screen now. Until next time, keep your eyes and ears open. Cheerio!